Chapter 51. Who is this sensei you keep talking about? My brother asked. I told you about him the other day, remember? I replied, crossly, annoyed that he could so easily forget the answer to a question he himself had asked. Yes, I know what you said then. He was implying that what I had said didn't explain it. Personally, I felt no need to bother trying to explain sensei to my brother. But I was angry. That's just like him, I thought. My brother was assuming that since I so evidently respected this man I honored with the name sensei, he must be someone of distinction in the world, at the very least a professor at the university. What could be impressive about someone who had made no name for himself and did nothing? This instinct of my brother was in complete accord with my father's, but while my father had jumped to the conclusion that sensei was living an idle life because he was incapable of doing anything, my brother spoke in terms that dismissed him as hopelessly lazing about despite his abilities. Egoists are worthless types. It's sheer brazen laziness to spend your life doing nothing. A man's talent amounts to nothing if he won't set it to work and do all he can with it. I felt like retorting that my brother didn't seem to understand the meaning of the word egoist, which he was bandying about. Still, he added as an afterthought, if this fellow can find you a position, it's a fine thing. Father's delighted at the prospect as well, you know? As for me, I could not believe sensei could do such a thing until he gave me a clear answer, nor did I have the courage to claim otherwise. But thanks to my mother's announcement of her hasty conclusions, I could not suddenly turn around and deny it. My longing for a letter from sensei needed no urging from her, and I prayed that when it came, it might somehow fulfill everyone's hopes with word of a position that would make me a living. Faced with the expectations of my father, so close to death, my mother with her urgent desire that he should be somehow reassured, and my brother and his statements that a man wasn't fully human unless he worked, and indeed all the other relatives, I found myself tormented by an issue that I privately cared nothing about. Not long afterward, my father vomited a strange yellow substance, and I recalled the danger that sensei and his wife had spoken of. His stomach must be upset from being bedridden for so long, my mother concluded. Tears came to my eyes to see how little she understood. When my brother and I met in the sitting room, he said, "Did you hear?" He was referring to something the doctor had said to him as he was leaving. I needed no explanation to understand its import. My brother looked at me over his shoulder. "Would you like to come back home and manage the place?" I could make no reply. "Mother won't be able to cope with it on her own," he went on. Apparently he was perfectly happy to let me rot here in the dank and dreary countryside. "You can do all the reading you like in the country, and you would not have to work. It would suit you down to the ground." "The elder son's the one who ought to come back," I said. "How could I do that?" he said, curtly dismissing the suggestion. He was driven by the powerful urge to work in the wider world. "If you don't want to do it, I suppose we could ask our uncle to help out, but someone will have to take mother in. The first big question is whether she would be willing to live here or not." Even while our father still alive, we were talking at cross purposes about what would happen after his death. Chapter 52. In his delirium, my father sometimes spoke aloud. "General Nogi fills me with shame," he mumbled from time to time. "Mortified to think of it. No, I will be following His Majesty very soon too." These words disturbed my mother. She did her best to gather everyone at his bedside. That seemed to be what my father wanted, as whenever he was fully conscious, he constantly complained of loneliness. He was particularly upset if he looked around and found no sign of my mother. "Where's Omitsu?" he would ask, and even when he did not speak the question, it was evident in his eyes. I would often stand and go to call her. She would leave what she had begun to do and come to the sick room, saying, "Is there anything I can do?" But sometimes he would simply gaze wordlessly at her. At other times, he would talk about something quite irrelevant. Or he would surprise her by saying gently, "You have been very good to me, Omitsu." At this, my mother's eyes would always fill with tears. Then, however, she would remember his earlier, healthy self and remark, "He sounds so tender now, but he was quite a tyrant in the old days, you know." She told the tale of how he had beaten her on the back with a broomstick. My brother and I had heard the story many times before, but now we listened with very different feelings. hearing in her words a precious recollection of one as it were already dead. Though the dark shadow of death hovered before his eyes, my father still did not speak of how he wished to his estate to be managed after death. Don't you think we should ask while there's still time? My brother said, looking anxiously at me. Yes, I guess so, I replied. I could see arguments both for and against bringing up the subject when he was so ill. We decided in the end to take the question to our uncle before making a final decision. But he too scratched his head over the problem. It would be a great pity if he died leaving things he wanted to say unsaid. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem right to press things from our side. The question ended up bogged down in indecision, and then my father slipped into unconsciousness. My mother, as innocent as ever, mistook it for sleep and was quite pleased. It's a relief for everyone around if he can sleep as well as this, she said. Occasionally my father would suddenly open his eyes and ask after one or another of us, always someone who had only just left his bedside. He seemed to have dark and light areas of consciousness, and the light part wove its way through the darkness like a discontinuous white thread, now there, now gone again. It was natural enough that my mother should confuse his comatose state for sleep. Then his words grew tangled. Sentences he began would end in confusion, so that often his speech made no sense. Yet when he first began to speak, it was in a voice so strong it seemed incredible that it emerged from one on his deathbed. Meanwhile, whenever we spoke to him, we had to raise our voices and bring our lips close to his ear. Does that feel good when I cool your head? The nurse and I changed his water pillow, then laid a fresh ice pack on his head, pressing it gently on the bald area above his forehead until the sharp little fragments of chopped ice inside the bag settled with a harsh rustle. Just then my brother came in from the corridor and silently handed me a postal item. My right hand on the ice pack, I took it with my left, and as my hand received the weight, I registered puzzled surprise. It was considerably heavier than the usual letter. It wasn't in a normal size envelope. Indeed, it was too bulky to fit in one. The package was wrapped in a piece of white writing paper, carefully pasted down. As soon as I took it from my brother, I realized it had been sent by registered mail. Turning it over, I saw Sensei's name, written in a careful hand. Busy as I was just then, I could not open the letter right away, so I slipped it into the breast of my kimono. Chapter 53. That day my father's condition seemed particularly bad. At one point, when I left the room to go to the toilet, I ran into my brother in the corridor. Where are you off to? He asked sharply, challenging me almost like a watch guard. We must try to be constantly with him. He seems in bed safe. I thought so too and returned to the sick room without touching the letter I had tucked away. My father opened his eyes and asked my mother to tell him who was present. She carefully named us one by one, and at each name he nodded. If he failed to nod, she raised her voice and repeated the name, asking if he understood. Thank you all very much, my father said with careful formality, then sank back into unconsciousness. Everyone gathered around his bed watched him in silence for a while. Finally, someone got up and went into the next room, then another left. I was the third to leave at last and go off to my room. I intended to open the letter I had earlier slipped into my breast. I could, of course, easily have done this at the bedside, but the letter was evidently so long that I could not have read it all then and there. So I stole some special time to myself to devote to the task. I tore roughly at the strong, fibrous paper that wrapped it. When I got it open, what emerged was a document written in a clear hand on ruled manuscript paper that had been folded in quarters to post. I bent back the kinks of the folds to strengthen the pages for ease of reading. My astonished heart wondered what this great bulk of pages and its linked writing might tell me. Simultaneously, I was anxious about what was happening in the sick room. I was in no state of mind to settle down calmly and read Sensei's letter. I had a strong foreboding that if I began it, something would have happened to my father before I finished, or at the least, someone would call me to his bedside. Nervously, I ran my eye over the first page. This is what it said. When you asked me that day about my past, I had not the courage to reply, but I believe I have now achieved the freedom to lay the story clearly before you. This freedom, however, is merely circumstantial and will be lost if I wait until your return to Tokyo. And if I do not make use of it while I may, I will have forever missed the chance to present you with the story of my past, which will then become indirectly your own experience. If this opportunity is missed, that firm promise I made to you will have come to naught. Therefore, I must relate with my pen the words I should be speaking to you. Only when I had read this far did I fully understand why he had written this long missive. I had believed all along that he would not bother sending a letter on the trivial question of my future employment. But why should Sensei, who disliked writing, have felt the urge to write about the past at such length? Why had it been impossible for him to wait until I returned? I am telling you because I am now free to, but that freedom will soon be lost forever. I turned the words over and over in my head, struggling to understand. Then a sudden anxiety flooded me. I returned to the letter, determined to read on. But at this moment there came a shout from my brother, calling to me from the sick room. Startled, I jumped to my feet and ran down the corridor to join the others. I was prepared for this to be my father's end. Chapter 54. The doctor had appeared in the sick room and was giving my father another enema in an attempt to ease his discomfort. The nurse, who had stayed up with him all night, was asleep in another room. Unused to such scenes, my brother was standing there looking unnerved. "Lend us a hand here," he said when he saw me, and sat down again. I took his place by the bedside, helping out by holding the piece of oiled paper under my father's buttocks. My father began to look a little more comfortable. The doctor stayed with him for about half an hour and checked the results of the enema, then left, saying he would be back. As he was on his way out, he made a point of telling us we should call him at any time if something untoward occurred. Even though something seemed likely to happen at any moment, I left the fraught atmosphere of the sick room to make another attempt to read Sensei's letter, but I was quite unable to compose myself and give the words my attention. As soon as I was settled at my desk, I fully expected my brother to call out for me again, and my hand holding the letter shook with fear that this time it really would be the end. I flipped abstractedly through the pages, my eyes taking in the careful script that filled the little squares of the manuscript paper, but completely unable to concentrate enough to read it. I could barely even skim it for a general sense of what was written. I went through page after page until I reached the last, then began to fold them up to leave on the desk. As I did so, a couple of lines near the close of the letter caught my eye. "When this letter reaches your hands, I will no longer be in this world. I will be long dead." I caught my breath. My heart, until that moment agitated and distracted, instantly froze. I ran my eyes hastily back through the letter from the end, picking up a sentence here or there on each page. My eyes attempted to pierce the flickering words passing in front of them, in a desperate attempt to gain an understanding. All I wanted was reassurance that Sensei was safe. His past, that vague past that he had promised to explain, was completely beside the point in my present state of urgent need. At length, having run through the letter backward, I gave up and folded the pages, infuriated by this long letter that refused to give me the information I sought. I returned to the doorway of the sick room to check on my father's condition. All was unusually quiet around him. I beckoned to my mother, who was sitting there looking faint from weariness, and asked how he was. "He seems unchanged for the moment," she replied. I lowered my head to his face and asked, "How are you? Was the enema any help?" My father nodded. "Thanks," he said in a clear voice. His mind seemed surprisingly lucid. Retreating to my room once more, I checked the clock against the train timetable. Suddenly I stood, tightened my kimono belt, and thrust Sensei's letter into my sleeve. I went out through the back door. Frantically, I ran to the doctor's house. I had to ask him to tell me plainly whether my father would survive a few more days, to beg him to use injections or some means to keep him alive a little longer. Unfortunately, the doctor was out. I had neither the time nor the patience to await his return. I climbed into a rickshaw and hurried on to the station. Once there, I penciled a letter to my mother and brother, holding the page against the station wall. It was very brief, but I judged it was better than simply running off without apology or explanation. So I gave it to the rickshaw man and asked him to hurry and deliver it. Then, with the vigor of decision, I leaped onto the Tokyo-bound train. Seated in the thundering third-class carriage, I retrieved Sensei's letter from my sleeve and at last read it from beginning to end. Part 3. Sensei's Testament. Chapter 55. I have had 2 or 3 letters from you this summer. I seem to remember that in the second or third you asked my aid in securing a suitable position. When I read this, I had the impulse to help in some way. At the very least, I should have replied, and I felt bad that I did not. But I must confess that I made absolutely no effort in response to your request. Living, as you know, not much in a confined social milieu as entirely cut off from the social world, I simply had no means of doing so. But this was not my real problem. Truth to tell, I was just then struggling with the question of what to do about myself. Should I continue as I was, like a walking mummy doomed to remain in the human world? Or, but whenever I whispered in my heart, this or a horror overcame me. I was like a man who rushes to the edge of a cliff and suddenly finds himself gazing down into a bottomless chasm. I was a coward suffering precisely the agony that all cowards suffer. Sorry as I am to admit it, the simple truth is that your existence was the last thing on my mind. Indeed, to put it bluntly, the question of your work, of how you should earn a living, was utterly meaningless to me. I didn't care, it was the least of my problems. I left your letter in the letter rack, folded my arms, and returned to my thoughts. Far from feeling sympathetic, I did no more than cast a bitter glance your way. A fellow from a family with a decent amount of property, only just graduated and already making a fuss about a job. I confess this to you now by way of explanation for my unforgivable failure to respond. I am not being intentionally rude to stir your anger. I believe that as you read on, you will fully understand. At all events, I neglected to reply as I should have done, and I now apologize for my remissness. Afterward, I sent you a telegram. In truth, I rather wanted to see you just then. I wanted to tell you the story of my past, as you had asked. When you replied that you could not come to Tokyo, I sat for a long time gazing at the telegram in disappointment. You must have felt that your brief response was not enough, for you then wrote me that long letter from which I understood the circumstances that held you at home. I have no cause to consider you rude. How could you have left your dear sick father back at home and come? Indeed, it was wrong of me to have summoned you so high-handedly, ignoring the problem of your father's health. I had forgotten about him when I sent that telegram, I must admit. This despite the fact that I was the one who so earnestly advised you to take good care of him and emphasized how dangerous his illness was. I am an inconsistent creature. Perhaps it is the pressure of my past and not my own perverse mind that has made me into this contradictory being. I am all too well aware of this fault in myself. You must forgive me. When I read your letter, the last letter you wrote, I realized I had done wrong. I thought of writing to that effect, but I took up my pen, then laid it down again without writing a line. If I were to write to you, it must be this letter you see, and the time for that had not yet quite come. That is why I sent a simple telegram saying you need to come. Chapter 56. I then began to write this letter. Being unaccustomed to writing, I have agonized over the difficulty of describing my thoughts and experiences precisely as I wanted. Time and again, I almost reached the point of giving up and abandoning the effort to fulfill my promise to you, but it was useless to put down the pen and decide to stop. Within an hour, the urge to write would return. You may well attribute this simply to my nature as someone who is meticulous about promises and obligations. I don't deny it. Being, as you know, quite isolated from human intercourse, I have not a single truly binding obligation in my life, whether intentionally or by nature. I have lived so as to keep such ties to an absolute minimum. Not that I am indifferent to obligation. No, I spend my days so passively because of my very sensitivity to such things. I lack the energy to withstand the toll they take on my nerves. And so once I make a promise, it distresses me deeply if I do not fulfill it. It is partly in order to avoid being distressed on account of you that I must keep taking up the pen. Besides, I want to write. I want to write about my past, quite aside from the obligation involved. My past is my own experience. One might call it my personal property, And perhaps, being property, it could be thought a pity not to pass it on to someone else before I die. This is certainly more or less how I feel about it, but I would rather that my experience be buried with me than be passed to someone incapable of receiving it. In truth, if you did not exist, my past would have remained just that and would not become someone else's knowledge even at second hand. Among the many millions of Japanese, it is to you alone that I want to tell the story of my past because you are sincere. You are serious in your desire to learn real lessons from life. I will not hesitate to cast upon you the shadow thrown by the darkness of human life. But do not be afraid. Gaze steadfastly into this darkness and find there the things that will be of use to you. The darkness which I speak is a moral darkness. I was born a moral man and raised as one. My morality is probably very different from that of a young people today, but different though it may be, it is my own. It is not some rented clothing I have borrowed to suit the moment. This is why I believe it will be of some use to you, a young man just starting out in life. You and I have often argued over questions of modern thought. As I'm sure you remember, you well understand my own position on such things, I'm sure. I never felt outright contempt for your opinions, yet I could not bring myself to actually respect them. Nothing lay behind your ideas. You were too young to have had your own experience. Sometimes I smiled, at times I glimpsed dissatisfaction on your face. Meanwhile, you were also pressing me to unroll my past before you like some painted scroll. This was the first time I actually privately respected you. You revealed a shameless determination to seize something really alive from within my very being. You were prepared to rip open my heart and drink at its warm fountain of blood. I was still alive then. I did not want to die. And so I evaded your urgings and promised to do as you asked another day. Now I will wrench open my heart and pour its blood over you. I will be satisfied if, when my own heart has ceased to beat, your breast houses new life. Chapter 57. I was not yet 20 when I lost both my parents. My wife told you, I remember, that they died of the same illness. You were astonished when she said they died at virtually the same time. The fact is that my father contracted the dreaded typhoid fever and my mother became infected through nursing him. I was their only son. The family was quite wealthy, so I was brought up in considerable comfort. Looking back, I now think that if my parents had not died when they did, if one of them, it does not matter which, had continued to be there to support me, I would have remained as generous and easygoing as I was in those days. Their deaths left me stunned and helpless. I had no knowledge, no experience, no wisdom. My mother had been too ill to be with my father when he died. She did not even learn of his death before she died herself. I have no idea whether she intuited it or whether she believed what those around her told her, that he was on the road to recovery. She left everything in the hands of my uncle. I was at her bedside with him when she indicated me and begged him to look after me. I already have gained my parents' permission to go up to Tokyo, and she evidently intended to tell him so, but she had only got as far as saying, "He'll go too," when my uncle broke in with, "Very good, you have no need to worry." He turned to me and said, "Your mother's a fine, strong woman." Perhaps he was referring to how well she was coping with the throes of fever. Looking back on it now, though, it is hard to say whether those words of hers, in fact, constituted a kind of last will. She was, of course, aware of the identity of the terrible illness my father had contracted, and knew well she had also been infected by it. But did she understand that she too was dying? It is impossible to say, and no matter how lucidly and sensibly she spoke in her fevered states, she often would have no memory of it later. So perhaps, but I must stick to the point. The fact is that I had already developed the habit of taking nothing at face value but analyzing and turning things over obsessively in my mind. I should explain this to you before I proceed. The following anecdote, though not particularly relevant to my story, serves as a good example of this trait. So please read it in that light. For I feel my impulse to doubt the honorable nature of others' actions and behavior probably grew from this time. This had unquestionably much exacerbated my suffering and misery, and I want you to keep that in mind. I must not confuse you by such digressions. Let me return to my tale. It's possible I'm writing this long letter to you with a calmer heart than someone else in my position might. The rumble of streetcars, which disturbs the night once the world is sleeping, has now ceased. Beyond the doors, the faint, touching song of a little cricket has begun, subtly evoking the transient dews of autumn. My innocent wife is sleeping soundly and unaware in the next room. My pen moves over the page, the sound of its tip registering each word and stroke. It is with a tranquil heart that I sit here before the page. My hand may slip from lack of practice, but I do not believe my clumsy writing derives from an agitated mind. Chapter 58. Left alone in the world as I was, I could only do as my mother said and throw myself on my uncle's mercy. For his part, he took over all responsibilities and saw to my needs. He also arranged for me to go to Tokyo as I wished. I came to Tokyo and entered the college here. College students in those days were far wilder and rougher than they are today. One boy I knew, for instance, got into an argument with a working man one night and struck him with his wooden clock, leaving a gash in his head. He had been drinking, as therefore the man seized the boy's school cap and made off with it. His name, of course, was clearly printed on a white cloth patch inside the cap. This all produced such a ruckus that the police threatened to report the matter to the school, but luckily the boy's friends stepped in and managed to keep it out of the public eye. No doubt tales of this sort of wild behavior must sound utterly foolish to someone of your generation, brought up in more refined times. I find it foolish myself, but students in those days did at least have a touching simplicity that present-day students lack. The monthly allowance my uncle sent me was far smaller than the amount you now receive from your father. Of course, things were cheaper then, I suppose, yet I never felt the slightest lack. Furthermore, I was never in the unfortunate position of having to envy the financial good fortune of any other classmate. More likely they envied me, I realize now. Besides my fixed monthly allowance, I also applied to my uncle quite often for money for books. Even as a student, I enjoyed buying books and other incidental expenses, and I was able to use this memory just as I liked. Money, just as I liked. Innocent that I was, I trusted my uncle completely. Indeed, I felt grateful respect for him. He was an entrepreneur and had been a member of the prefectural government. No doubt this was behind the connection with one of the political parties that I also recall. He was my father's full brother, but they seem to have developed a very different characters. My father was a true gentleman and managed his inheritance with great diligence. He enjoyed elegant traditional pursuits such as flower arranging and ceremonial tea making and reading books of poetry. I believed he had quite an interest in antique books and such things as well. Our house was in the country, about 5 miles from town, where my uncle lived. The antiques dealer in town would sometimes come all the way out to show my father scrolls, incense holders, and so on. The English expression, a man of means, probably sums up my father. He was a country gentleman of somewhat cultivated tastes. He and my bustling, worldly uncle were thus of very different temperaments, yet they were oddly close. My father would often praise him as a professional man, much more capable and reliable than himself. People in his own position who inherit their wealth often find, he told me, that their native abilities lose their edge. His problem was he had no money to fight his way in the world. My father said this both to my mother and to me, but his words seemed specifically for my benefit. He fixed his gaze on me and said, "You would better remember that." I did as I was told and remember his words to this day. How could I have doubted my uncle's integrity? Then, when my father had praised him so highly and trusted him so thoroughly, I would have been proud of him even had my parents lived. Now that they were dead and I was left entirely in his care, it was no longer simple pride I felt. My uncle had become essential for my survival. Chapter 59. The first time I returned from Tokyo for the summer holidays, my uncle and aunt had moved into the house where I had suffered through the death of my parents and were now ensconced there. This had been decided on before I left for Tokyo. It was the only thing to be done since I was the only remaining person in our family and no longer living there myself. My uncle, I recall, was involved with a number of companies in the town at the time. When we were discussing how to arrange things so that I would be free to go to Tokyo, he had remarked half jokingly that it would actually be more convenient for him to stay in his home in town to attend to his work, rather than move out to this house 5 miles away. My family home was an old and important one in the area, fairly well known to the local people. As you probably know, to demolish or sell an old house with a history when there is an heir who could live there is a serious matter. Nowadays, I would not let such things bother me, but I was still essentially a child. The problem of leaving the house empty while I was living in Tokyo was a great worry for me. My uncle grudgingly agreed to move into the empty house that now belonged to me, but he insisted he would need to keep his house in town and move to and fro between the two as the need arose. I was, of course, in no position to object. I was happy to accept any condition as long as I could get to Tokyo. Child that I still was, I looked back with a warm nostalgia on the house I had now left. I felt about it as a traveler feels about the home to which he will one day return. For all that I had longed to leave it for Tokyo, I had a strong compulsion to go back there when the summer holidays came, and I often had dreams of the house I would return to after the hard study and fun of the term were over. I do not know just how my uncle divided his time between the two places while I was away, but when I arrived in the summer, the whole family was gathered there under a single roof. I imagined that the children were there for the holidays, although they would have lived in town for most of the year to attend school. Everyone was delighted to see me, and I was happy to find the house so much livelier and more cheerful than it had been in my parents' day. My uncle moved his eldest son out of the room that had been mine so that I could occupy it again. There were quite enough rooms to go around, and at first I demurred, saying I didn't mind where I slept, but he would not hear of it. "It's your house," he told me. Recollections of my dead mother and father were all that disturbed the pleasure of the summer I spent with my uncle's family before returning to Tokyo. But one event did cast a faint shadow across my heart. Although I had barely begun my college life, my uncle and aunt both urged me to consider marrying. They must have repeated it 3 or 4 times. The first time they brought up the subject, it was so unexpected that I was no longer more than taken aback. The second time, I made my refusal clear. When they brought it up a third time, I was forced to ask their reasons for pressing marriage on me in this way. The answer was brief and straightforward. They simply wanted me to make an early marriage so that I could come back to live in the house and become my father's heir. Personally, all I wanted to do was to come back during vacations. I was familiar enough with country ways to understand this talk of succeeding my father and the consequent need for a wife, of course, and I was not even really against the idea. But I had only just gone to Tokyo to pursue my studies, and to me it was all in some distant future landscape, seen as it were through a telescope. I left the house without consenting to my uncle's wish. Chapter 60. I forgot all about this talk of marriage. None of the young fellows around me, after all, had the air of responsible householders. All seemed their own men, individual and free of constraints. If I had penetrated below the apparent happiness, I might have found some whom family circumstance had already forced to marry, but I was too young and innocent to be aware of such things then. Besides, anyone who found himself in that kind of situation would have kept it to himself as far as possible, considering it private and quite irrelevant to a student's life. I now realized that I was already in this category of myself, but in my innocence I continued to pursue my studies contentedly. At the end of the school year, I once more packed my trunk and returned to the home that held my parents' graves. Once I found my uncle and aunt and their children in the house where my parents used to live. Nothing had changed. I breathed again the familiar scent of my home, a scent still filled with nostalgic memories. Needless to say, I also welcomed being back there as a relief from the monotony of the year's studies. But even as I breathed this scent, so redolent of the air I had grown up in, my uncle suddenly thrust the question of marriage under my nose again. He repeated his line from my previous visit, giving the same reason as before. But while the summer before he had no particular woman in mind, this time I was disconcerted to learn that a prospective wife had been selected for me. She was my uncle's daughter, in other words, my own cousin. Marrying her would suit both of us, he maintained. And furthermore, my father had actually spoken of it before he died. Put this way, I supposed it was a suitable enough arrangement, and I easily accepted that my father could have had the conversation with my uncle. I was certainly rather surprised, since this was the first time I had heard of it. My uncle's request seemed perfectly reasonable and comprehensible, however. No doubt I should not have taken his words on faith, but what primarily concerned me was that I felt quite indifferent to this younger daughter of my uncle. We had been close ever since childhood, when I had been a constant visitor at my uncle's house in town, not only on day visits but also as an overnight guest. As you will know, romantic love never develops between siblings. I may be stretching the interpretation of this well-known fact, but it seems to me that between any male and female who have been close and in continual contact, such great intimacy rules out the fresh response necessary to stimulate feelings of romantic love. Just as you can only really smell incense in the first moments after it is lit, or taste wine in that instant of the first sip. The impulse of love springs from a single, perilous moment in time, I feel. If this moment slips casually by, unnoticed, intimacy may grow as the two become accustomed to each other, but the impulse to romantic love will be numbed. And so, consider it as I might, I could not find it in me to marry my cousin. My uncle said that if I wanted, I could put off the marriage until after my graduation. But he went on, we should seize the day, as the saying goes, and perform the basic exchange of marriage cups as soon as possible. The question of when it should happen was of no concern to me, since I felt no interest in the bride. I reiterated my refusal. My uncle looked unsatisfied, and my cousin wept. Hers were not tears of regret that she could not take her place beside me. They were the tears of a humiliated woman who has sought marriage and been rejected. I knew perfectly well that she loved me as little as I loved her. I went back to Tokyo. Chapter 61. A year later, at the beginning of the following summer, I went back home for the third time. As always, I could not wait to finish final exams and get out of Tokyo, which indicates how much I long for my home. I'm sure you know this well too. The very color of the air in the place I was born was different. The smell of the earth was special, redolent with memories of my parents. To spend July and August nestled back inside that world, motionless as a snake in its hole, filled me with warm pleasure. My innocent and uncomplicated mind felt no need to bother itself much over the problem of the proposed marriage to my cousin. If you didn't want to do something, you simply said no, I believed, and there would be no further repercussions. So although I had not submitted to my uncle's will, I remained unperturbed. I returned home in my usual high spirits after a year spent unworried by the question. But when I got home, I discovered that my uncle's attitude had changed. He did not embrace me with a welcoming smile as he had before. For the first 4 or 5 days, I remained unaware of the change. My loving upbringing had not prepared me even to recognize coldness. Finally, however, some chance event finally brought it to my notice. I then realized in bewilderment that it was not only my uncle who had changed, but also my aunt. My cousin was also odd, and so was my uncle's son, who had earlier written a friendly letter asking me to investigate the industrial college he intended to enter in Tokyo once he had graduated from middle school. Being who I am, I puzzled over this development. Why had my feelings changed, or rather, why had theirs changed? Then it occurred to me that perhaps my dead parents had suddenly cleansed my dulled eyes and given me a clear vision of the world. Deep inside, you see, I felt that my parents continued to love me as in life. Even though I was already well acquainted with the real world by then, the strong superstitious beliefs of my ancestors coursed deep in my blood. No doubt they still do. I climbed the nearby hill alone and knelt before my parents' graves, half in mourning and half in gratitude. I prayed to them to watch over me, feeling as I prayed that my future happiness lay in those hands buried beneath the cold stone. You may laugh, and no doubt I deserve it, but that is who I was. In a flash, my whole world changed. This was not, mind you, my first such experience. When I was 16 or 17, my sudden discovery of beauty in the world had stunned me. Many times I rubbed my eyes in sheer disbelief and doubted my own eyes, while my heart exclaimed, "Ah, how beautiful!" At that age, boys and girls alike attain what is commonly called sensuality. In this new state, I was for the first time able to see women as representative of their beauty that the world contains. My eyes, until then quite blind to this beauty in the opposite sex, sprang open, and from that moment my universe was transformed. It was with precisely the same sort of shock that I became conscious of the change in my uncle's attitude to me. I was stunned by the realization which came upon me abruptly, without any premonition. Suddenly, my uncle and his family seemed to me completely different creatures. I was haunted by the feeling that I must make some move, or who knew what might befall me. Chapter 62. I decided that I owed it to my dead parents to obtain a detailed understanding of the house and property that I had until then left for my uncle to look after. My uncle presented himself as living a hectic life. He bustled endlessly between the two town house and the country estate, spending perhaps 1 in 3 nights in town. Forever on the move, he made a great fuss about how busy he was. I had always taken him at his word, although I sometimes cynically suspected that he was following the modern fashion to appear busy. But now, with my newfound desire to find a time to talk through the question of property, I could only interpret this endless rush as an excuse to avoid me. I never had a chance to pin him down. A friend of mine from middle school days told me that my uncle kept a mistress in town. Knowing the sort of man he was, I had no reason to doubt that he might have a mistress. But I had no memory of such talk while my father was alive, so the rumor startled me. The friend also passed on to me various other rumors that were circulating about my uncle. Among them was the story that his business had been generally thought to be going under, but in the last 2 or 3 years, it had suddenly revived and prospered. This still heightened my own suspicions. I finally managed to open negotiations with my uncle. Perhaps the word negotiations is a little harsh, but as we talked, the tenor of our relations sank to such a low level that only this word can express what took place. My uncle persisted in treating me as a child, while I viewed him through the jaundiced eyes of suspicion. Under these circumstances, the chances of a peaceful resolution were nil. Unfortunately, my need to press on with my story prevents me from describing the details of those negotiations for you. To tell the truth, there is another more important matter I have yet to speak of, one that I have with difficulty restrained my pen from writing all this time. I have lost forever the chance to talk quietly with you, and now I am also forced to omit some of what I would like to write, not only because I lack the skill to express myself on the page, but also because time is precious to me. You may remember I once said to you that no one is inherently bad by nature, and I warned you to be careful because most honest folk will suddenly turn bad when circumstances prompt it. You warned me I was becoming excited and upset, and you asked me what kind of circumstances provoked good people to become wicked. When I answered with a single word, money, you looked dissatisfied. I well remember that look. I can reveal to you now that I was thinking at the moment of my uncle. I was thinking of him with hatred as an example of an ordinary, decent person who will suddenly turn bad when he sees money, and I was thinking of the fact that no one in this world is to be trusted. Probably my reply dissatisfied you because you were bent on seeing things in terms of philosophical questions, and you found my answer trite, but I spoke from experience. I was upset at the time, I agree, but I believe that a commonplace idea stated with passionate conviction carries more living truth than some novel observation expressed with cool indifference. It is the force of blood that drives the body, after all. Words are not just vibrations in the air, they work more powerfully than that, and on more powerful objects. Chapter 63. To put it simply, my uncle cheated me out of my inheritance. He did it with ease during the 3 years that I spent in Tokyo. From a worldly perspective, I was an absolute fool to have left everything in my uncle's hands without a thought. From some more elevated viewpoint, perhaps I could be admired as pure and innocent. But when I look back on that self now, I wonder why I should have been born so innocent, and that foolish credulity makes me grind my teeth. And yet I also long to be once again that person who still retained his first innate purity. Bear in mind, bear in mind that the sensei you know is a man who has been sullied by the world. If we define our betters as those who have spent more years being tarnished by the dirt of the world, then I can certainly claim to be your better. Would I have been materially better off if I had married my cousin as my uncle wanted? The answer is clear, I think. But the fact is, my uncle was scheming to force his daughter on me. He wasn't offering me this marriage out of some kindly intended idea of how well it would suit both sides of the family. No, what drove him was the baser motive of personal profit. I did not love my cousin, but nor did I dislike her. Still, thinking back on it now, I can see it gave me a certain degree of pleasure to refuse her. Of course, my refusal did not alter the basic fact that he was cheating me, but at least as the victim, I had the satisfaction of standing up for myself a little. I wasn't letting him entirely have his way. This point is so trivial, however, that it is hardly worth bothering over. To your outsider's point of view, it must seem like nothing more than foolishly stubborn pride. Other relatives stepped in to mediate between us. They were people I did not trust at all. Indeed, I felt quite hostile toward them. Having discovered my uncle's treachery, I was convinced that others must be equally treacherous. After all, my reasoning went, if the man my father had praised so highly could behave like this, what could one expect of others? Nevertheless, this relative sorted out for me everything that pertained to my inheritance. Its cash value came to a great deal less than I had anticipated. I had only two options, to accept this accounting without complaint or to take my uncle to court. I was angry and I was confused. If I sued him, I feared the case might continue for a long time before it was settled. It also seemed to me that it would cause me added difficulties by taking precious time away from the studies I was still pursuing. After thinking it all through, I went to an old school friend in the town and arranged to have everything I had received converted to cash. My friend advised me against the plan, but I refused to listen to him. I had decided to leave my native home forever. I vowed that I would never lay eyes on my uncle again. Before I left, I paid a final visit to my parents' grave. I have not seen it since, and now I never will. My friend disposed of everything as I had asked. Naturally, it took some time after my return to Tokyo to finalize it all. Selling farmland in the country is no easy matter, and I had to be careful lest others take advantage of me. So in the end, I settled for a lot less than the market price. To be honest, my assets amounted to the few government bonds I had in my pocket when I left home, and the money my friend subsequently sent. Sadly, the inheritance my parents had left me was greatly diminished, and it felt all the worse because it was not profligacy on my part that had reduced it. Still, the proceeds were more than enough for me to survive on as a student. Indeed, I used less than half the interest from it, and it was this financial security that subsequently propelled me into an utterly unforeseen situation. Chapter 64. With my new financial freedom, I began to play with the idea of quitting my noisy boarding house and finding myself a house to live in. I soon realized, however, that this would entail the bother of buying the necessary furniture and employing a servant to run the household, one who was honest, so that I could leave the house unattended without worrying. One way or another, I could see that it would be no easy matter to achieve my plan. At any rate, I should look around for a suitable house, I thought, and with this aim at the back of my mind, one day I happened to go west down the slope of Hongo Hill and climb Koshikawa toward Danjun Temple. That area has changed completely since the streetcar line went in. Back then, the earthen wall of the arsenal was on the left, and on the right was a large expanse of grassy, vacant land, something between a hillside and an open field. I stood in the grass and gazed absent-mindedly at the bluff before me. The scenery there is still quite good, but in those days, that western side was far lovelier. Just to see the deep, rich green of all that foliage suited the heart. It suddenly occurred to me to wonder if there might not be a suitable house somewhere nearby. I immediately crossed the grassy expanse and set off north along a narrow lane. Today it is not a particularly good area, and even back then the houses were fairly ramshackle and run down. I wandered around, ducking down lanes and into side alleys. Finally, I asked a cake seller if she knew of any little house for rent in the area. She said and cocked her head for a moment or two. I can't think of anything offhand, seeing that she apparently had nothing to suggest. I gave up hope and was just turning for home when she asked, "Would you lodge with a family?" That set me thinking. Taking private lodgings in someone's home would save me a lot of the trouble involved in owning my own house. I sat down at her stall and asked her to tell me the details. It was the house of a military man, or rather of his surviving family. The cake seller thought he had probably died in the Sino-Japanese War. Until about a year before, the family had been living near the officers' academy in Ichigaya, but the place was too grand with stables and outbuildings and too big for the family, so they had sold it and moved to this area. Apparently, however, they felt lonely here, just the two of them, and had asked if she knew of a suitable lodger. She told me the household consisted solely of the widow, her daughter, and a maid. It sounded perfect for me, being so quiet and secluded, but I feared that if I were to turn up suddenly and offer myself, an unknown student, the widow might turn me down. Perhaps I should give up the idea then and there, I thought, but I was dressed quite respectably for a student, and besides, I was wearing my school cap. You will probably scoff at the idea that this was important, but in those days, unlike today, students had quite a good reputation, and my square cap invested me with a certain confidence. And so I followed the cake seller's directions and called in at the house unannounced. Introducing myself to the widow, I explained the purpose of my visit. She asked me numerous questions about my background, my school, and my studies. Something in my answers must have reassured her, for she said right away that I could move in whenever I wanted. I admired her thoroughly upright, plain-spoken air, a typical officer's wife, I decided. On the other hand, she also rather surprised me. Why should a woman of such apparent strength of character feel lonely? Chapter 65. I moved in immediately and was given the room where our initial interview had taken place. It was the best room in the house. At that time, a few better quality student boarding houses were springing up in the Hongo area, and I had a fair idea of the top of the range in student accommodation. The room I was now master of was far finer than anything else available. When I moved in, it seemed almost too good for a simple student like me. It was a large room of 8 tatami mats. The alcove had a pair of staggered shelves set into one side, and the wall opposite the veranda contained a long built-in cupboard. There were no windows, but the sun streamed in from the south-facing veranda. On the day I arrived, I noted the flowers arranged in the alcove and a koto propped beside them. I did not care for either. I had been brought up by a father who appreciated the Chinese style of poetry, calligraphy, and tea-making, and since childhood my own taste had also tended toward the Chinese. Perhaps for this reason I despised this sort of merely charming decorativeness. My uncle had squandered the collection of objects that my father had accumulated during his lifetime, but some at least had survived. Before I left home, I had asked my school friend to care for most of them, and carried 4 or 5 of the best scrolls away with me in my trunk. I intended to take them out as soon as I arrived and hang one in the alcove to enjoy it. But when I saw the flower arrangement and the koto, I lost my courage. Later I learned that these flowers had been put there especially to welcome me, and I smiled dryly to myself. The koto had been there all along, for one of somewhere else to store it. From this description, you will no doubt have sensed the presence of a young girl somewhere in the story. I must admit, I myself had been curious about the daughter ever since I first have heard of her. Perhaps because these guilty thoughts had robbed me of a natural response, or perhaps because I was still awkward with people. When I first met her, I managed only a flustered greeting. She in turn blushed. My imaginary idea of Ozo-san had been built on hints gained from her mother's appearance and manner. This fantasized image of her, however, was far from flattering. Having decided that the mother conformed to the type of the military wife, I proceeded to assume that Ozo-san would be much the same, but one look at the girl's face overturned all my preconceptions. In their place, a new and utterly unanticipated breed of woman pervaded me. From that moment, the flower arrangement in the alcove ceased to displease me. The koto prop beside it was no longer an annoyance. When the flowers in the alcove inevitably began to wilt, they were replaced with a new arrangement. From time to time, the koto was carried off to the L-shaped room diagonally opposite mine. I would sit at the desk in my room, chin propped on hands, listening to its plangent tone. I had no idea whether the playing was good or bad, but the fact that the pieces were fairly simple suggested that the player was not very skilled. No doubt her playing was of a piece with her flower arranging skills. I knew something of flower arranging and could see that she was far from good at it. Yet day after day flowers were unashamed arrayed in my alcove, although the arrangement always took the same form and the receptacle never changed. As for the music, it was odder than the flowers. She simply plucked dully away at the instrument. I never heard her really sing the accompanying songs. She did murmur the words, it's true, but in such a tiny voice that she might have been whispering secrets, and whenever the teacher scolded her, the voice ceased altogether. But I gazed in delight at those clumsy flower arrangements, and I listened with pleasure to the koto's awkward twang. Chapter 66. By the time I left home, I was already thoroughly disenchanted with the world. My conviction that others could not be trusted had, you might say, penetrated me to the marrow. My despised uncle and aunt and relatives seemed representative of the whole of humanity. Even on the train, I found myself glancing warily at my neighbors, and when someone occasionally spoke to me, my mistrust only deepened. I was sunk in depression. At times, I felt a suffocating pressure, as if I had swallowed lead. Yet at the same time, every nerve was on edge. This state of mind was largely what had prompted my decision to leave the noisy boarding house, I think. True, my financial security meant I could consider living in a place of my own, but my earlier self would never have thought of going to such border, no matter how much money might be in my pocket. For some time after my move to Koishikawa, I continued in a highly strung state. I kept glancing furtively about so much that I unnerved even myself. Although my mind and eyes were abnormally active, my tongue grew less and less inclined to speak. I sat silently at my desk, observing those around me like a cat. Sometimes my keen awareness of them was so intense it shamed me to think of it. All that distinguished me from a thief was that I was stealing nothing, I thought in self-disgust. You must find all this most peculiar. How on earth did I have energy to spare to feel attracted to Ozo-san, to delight in gazing at her clumsy flower arrangements or listen with joy to her inept playing? I can only answer that these were the facts, and as such I must lay them before you. I will leave it up to your clever mind to analyze them and simply add one thing. I distrusted the human race where money was concerned, but not yet in the realm of love. So despite the obvious contradiction, both states of mind happily coexisted inside me. I always called the widow by the polite title of Oku-san, so I shall do the same here. Oku-san apparently considered me a quite well-behaved person, and she was full of praise for my studious habits. She made no mention of the uneasy glances or the troubled, suspicious air. Perhaps she simply did not notice it, or maybe she was too polite to speak of it. At any event, it never seemed to bother her. Once she even admiringly told me I had a generous heart. I was honest enough to blushingly deny this, but she insisted. You only said that because you are not aware of it yourself, she said earnestly. The fact is, she had not originally planned on having a student as a boarder. When she had asked around the neighborhood if anyone knew of a lodger, she had thought in terms of a government official or the like. I imagine she was envisaging some underpaid fellow who could not afford a place of his own. Compared with her impoverished imaginary lodger, I struck her as far more generous in my ways. I guess I was in fact more liberal with my money than someone in more straitened circumstances would have been. But this was a product of circumstance rather than any natural generosity, so it was hardly an indication of what kind of person I was. In her woman's way, however, Oku-san did her best to view my liberality with money as an expression of my general character. Chapter 67. Oku-san's warm perception of me inevitably started to influence my state of mind. After a while, my glances became less mistrustful and my heart felt more tranquil and settled within me. This new happiness I owed, in effect, to the way Okusan and the rest of the household turned a blind eye on all my wariness and safety glances. No one reacted nervously to me, and so my own nerves grew steadily calmer. Perhaps she did indeed find me generous and open-hearted, as she claimed, but Okusan was a wise woman, and her treatment of me may well have been intentional, or she may simply not have noticed anything odd, since all my nervous activity was largely in my mind and may not have been evident to others. Gradually, as my inner turmoil subsided, I grew closer to the family. I could now joke with Okusan and her daughter. Sometimes they invited me to have tea with them, and on other evenings I would bring cakes and invite them to join me in my room. My social world had suddenly expanded, I felt. I constantly found my precious study time frittered away on conversation, but oddly, this disruption never bothered me. Okusan was therefore a lady of leisure. Ozu-san not only went to school but had her flower arranging and koto study, so she should by rights have been extremely busy. But to my surprise, she seemed to have all the time in the world. Whenever the three of us came across one another, we would settle down for a long chat. It was generally Ozu-san who arrived to fetch me. She would come via the veranda to stand in front of my room, or else approach to the sitting room and appear at the sliding doors that led to the room next to mine. She would always pause in front of my room. Then she would call my name and say, "Are you studying?" I was usually sitting staring at some difficult book lying open on the desk in front of me, so no doubt I looked impressively studious. But to tell the truth, I wasn't devoting myself to my books as much as it might seem. Though my eyes were fixed on the page, I was really just waiting for her to come for me. If she failed to appear, I would have to make a move. I would rise to my feet and make my way to her room and ask the same question, "Are you studying?" Ozu-san occupied a six-mat room beyond the sitting room. Oku-san was sometimes in the sitting room, sometimes in her daughter's. Neither had a room she considered exclusively her own. Despite the partition between them, the two rooms formed a single space, with mother and daughter moving freely between them. When I stood outside and called, it was always Oku-san who answered, "Come on in." Even if Ozu-san happened to be there as well, she rarely responded herself. In time, Ozu-san developed the occasional habit of coming to my room on some errand and then settling down to talk. Whenever this happened, a strange uneasiness beset my heart. It wasn't simply a nervous response to finding myself alone, face to face with a young woman. Her presence made me oddly fidgety and ill at ease, and this unnatural behavior distressed me as a self-betrayal. She, however, was entirely at her ease. It was difficult to believe that this unabashed girl and the girl who managed to produce only a timid whisper when practicing her koto singing could be the same person. On occasion, she stayed so long that her mother called her from the sitting room. "Coming," she would answer, but she continued to sit there. Yet she was far from a mere child. This much my eyes told me clearly, and I could see too that she was behaving in a way that let me know as much. Chapter 68. I would sigh with relief after Ozu-san left my room, but I also felt a certain dissatisfaction and regret. Perhaps there was something girlish in me. I imagine a modern youth such as you would certainly think so. But in those days, this was the way most of us were. Oku-san rarely left the house, and on the few occasions when she did, she never left me alone with her daughter. I can't judge whether this was intentional. It may be out of place for me to say this, but after careful observation, I could only conclude that Oku-san wanted to bring us closer. Yet at other times, she seemed secretly guarded. I had never been in such a situation, and it often made me uncomfortable. I needed Oku-san to make her position clear. Rationally speaking, her attitudes were clearly contradictory. But with the memory of my uncle's deceitfulness still so fresh, I could not repress another suspicion that one of her two conflicting attitudes must be fake. I was at a loss to decide which was the real one, and I could make no sense of why she behaved so strangely. At times, I chose simply to lay the fault entirely at the door of womanhood itself. When it comes down to it, I told myself, she's acting this way because she's a woman, and women are stupid. Whenever my cogitations arrived at a dead end, this answer was the one I reached for. Yet although I despised women, I could not find it in me to despise Ozu-san. Faced with her, my theorizing lost its power. I felt for her a love that was close to pious faith. You may find it odd that I use a specifically religious word to describe my feelings for a young woman, but real love, I firmly believe, is not so different from the religious impulse. Whenever I saw her face, I felt that I myself had become beautiful. At the mere thought of her, I felt elevated by contact with her nobility. If this strange phenomenon we call love can be said to have two poles, the higher of which is a sense of holiness and the baser the impulse of sexual desire, this love of mine was undoubtedly in the grip of love's higher realm. Being human, of course, I could not leave my fleshy self behind, yet the eyes that beheld her, the heart that treasured thoughts of her, knew nothing of the wreck of the physical. My love for the daughter grew as my antipathy toward the mother increased, and so the relationship among the three of us ceased to be the simple thing it had once been. This change was largely internal, mind you. On the surface, it was all the same. Then some little thing made me begin to wonder if I had misunderstood Oku-san. I now revised my idea that one of her two contradictory attitudes toward me and her daughter must be false. They did not inhabit her heart by turns. I decided they were both there together. Despite the apparent contradiction, I realized our careful watchfulness did not mean she had forgotten or reconsidered her urge to bring us closer. Her weariness surely sprang from the worrying possibility that we might become more intimate than she considered proper. Her anxiety seemed to me quite unnecessary, since I felt not the slightest physical urge toward her daughter, but I now ceased to think badly of Oku-san's motives. Chapter 69. Piecing together the various bits of evidence, it became clear to me, in a word, that the people of this household trusted me. In fact, I even found proof enough to convince me that this trust had existed from the very beginning. Having come to suspect others, I was oddly moved by this discovery. Were women too much more intuitive than men? I wondered. And did this account for women's tendency to be so easily deceived? In retrospect, these thoughts seem ironic, since I was responding just as irrationally and intuitive to Ozo-san. While swearing to myself that I would trust no one, my trust in her was absolute, and yet I found her mother's trust in me peculiar. I did not talk much about my home and was careful to make no mention of recent events. Just recalling them filled me with distress. I spent as much of our conversations as possible listening to Oku-san, but she had other ideas. She was always curious about my home and the situation there, so in the end I revealed everything. When I told her that I had decided never to return, that there was nothing left for me there except the graves of my parents, she seemed deeply moved, and her daughter actually wept. I thought then that it was good to have spoken. It made me happy. Now that I had told her all, it was abundantly clear that Oku-san felt her intuitions confirmed. She began to treat me like some young relative. This did not anger me. Indeed, I was pleased by it. But in time, my paranoid doubts returned. It was a tiny thing that sparked my suspicion. But as one insignificant incident was added to another, distrust gradually took root. I began to suspect that Oku-san was trying to bring her daughter and me together from the same motives as my uncle, and with this thought, what had appeared to be kindness suddenly seemed the actions of a cunning strategist. I brooded on this bitter conviction. Oku-san had always stated that she had wanted a lodger to look after because the house was forlornly unpeopled. This did not seem a lie to me. Having grown close enough to become her confidant, I was now quite sure it was true. On the other hand, she was not particularly wealthy. From the point of view of her own interest, she certainly had nothing to lose by cultivating the relationship. And so I grew wary again. Still, at times I scoffed at my own foolishness. What use was all my caution about her mother when I still loved Ozo-san as deeply as ever? But no matter how foolish I recognized myself to be, this contradiction was hardly a source of much pain. My real anguish began when it occurred to me that Ozo-san might be as devious as her mother. The instant it occurred to me that everything was a result of plotting behind my back, I was racked with agony. This was not mere unhappiness. I was in the grip of utter despair, and yet at the same time I continued to have unwavering faith in Ozo-san. Thus I found myself paralyzed, suspended between conviction and doubt. Both seemed to me at once the product of my imagination and the truth. Chapter 70. I kept up my attendance at college, but the professor's lectures sounded distant in my ears. It was the same with my own study. My eyes took in the print on the page, yet its meaning vanished like a wisp of smoke before it really penetrated. I grew taciturn. Several friends, misinterpreting this, reported to others that I seemed as if deep in meditation. I made no attempt to correct them. In fact, I was delighted to be provided with this convenient mask. But at times, some inner dissatisfaction would produce an outburst of high spirited romping, astonishing my friends. Not many visitors came to the house. The family seemed to have few relatives. Once in a while, Ozo-san's friends stopped by, but generally they would spend the time talking in such low voices that one could scarcely tell they were in the house. For all my heightened sensitivity, I did not realize that they spoke quietly out of deference to my presence. My own friends who came calling, though hardly rowdy, were not inclined to feel constrained by the presence of others. Thus, where guests were concerned, our roles were essentially reversed. I seemed the master of the house, while Ozo-san behaved like a timorous guest. I write this simply because it is something I recall, not because it bothered me. One thing did bother me, though. One day I heard the startling sound of a male voice coming from somewhere in the house, either the sitting room or Ozo-san's room. It was a very quiet voice, unlike that of my own visitors. I had no idea what he was saying, and the more I tried and failed to catch the words, the more it provoked my straining nerves. A strange sense of mounting frustration seized me as I sat in my room. I began by wondering whether he was a relative or only some acquaintance. Then I tried to guess if he was a young man or someone older. I had no way to tell from where I sat, yet I could not get up and open the door to look. My nerves were not so much trembling as afflicting me with strong waves of painful tension. Once the man left, I carefully inquired his name. They gave a simple and straightforward answer. Though I made it clear I was still not satisfied, I lacked the courage to ask further, nor, of course, did I have the right to do so. I had been taught to maintain dignified self-respect, but a blatant greed for information undermined it. Both were evident on my face. They laughed. So perturbed was my state that I was unable to judge whether their laughter was scornful or well-intentioned. Even once the incident had passed, I continued to mull over the thought that they might have been jeering at me. I was quite free. I could leave college at any time if I chose, go live anywhere I liked, or marry any girl I wished without having to consult anyone. Many times I had reached the decision to come right out and ask Oku-san if I could marry her daughter, but each time I hesitated and in the end said nothing. It wasn't that I was afraid of a refusal. I could not imagine how life might change for me if she turned me down, but I could at least still myself with the thought that a refusal might give me the advantage of a new perspective on the world. No, what irked me was the suspicion that they were luring me on. The thought that I could be innocently playing into their hands filled me with resentful rage. Ever since my uncle's deception, I was determined that come what may, I would never again become such easy prey.